There are moments in life that split everything into two halves, the before and the after. Moments so sharp, so brutal, that when you look back on them, you can't believe you survived them. And for Maya Caldwell, that moment came on a Tuesday evening in October, when she was 7 months pregnant, her feet swollen, her back aching, and her heart so full of love for the tiny life growing inside her, that she genuinely believed, with every fiber of her being, that she was the luckiest woman alive. She wasn't. She was standing in the kitchen of the beautiful home she had helped build with her own hands, not with money, but with choices, with sacrifice, with the kind of quiet devotion that most people don't even notice until it's gone. She was stirring a pot of soup because Derek had texted her that morning saying he'd be home for dinner. And despite everything, despite the fatigue, despite the way her ankles had started to look like small loaves of bread, despite the fact that she hadn't slept more than 4 hours the night before, she had gone to the market, bought the ingredients he liked, and started cooking at 4 in the afternoon just to make sure it would be perfect. That was Maya. That was always Maya. She heard the front door open. She heard his footsteps in the entryway, the familiar sound of his shoes on the hardwood floor she had picked out herself 2 years ago. She turned down the heat on the stove and called out his name with a warmth in her voice that was completely unrehearsed, completely real. She asked him how his day was. She told him dinner would be ready in 20 minutes. And then he walked into the kitchen, and something in the air changed. He didn't look at her the way he usually did. He didn't look tired or distracted or distant the way he had been for the past few months. He looked determined. He looked like a man who had made a decision and had spent the entire drive home rehearsing how to deliver it. He set his briefcase down on the kitchen counter, right next to the cutting board where she had just finished slicing bread, and he looked at her, and he said very calmly, very deliberately, 4 words that shattered every single thing she thought she knew about her life. I want a divorce. Maya didn't move. The wooden spoon in her hand stayed perfectly still over the pot. The soup continued to simmer. The clock on the wall continued to tick, and for a moment, just one long breathless moment, the world continued to function as if nothing had happened, as if the ground hadn't just opened beneath her feet. She turned to face him slowly. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach, resting on the curve of her belly the way it always did when she felt uncertain or afraid. She asked him if he was joking. She already knew he wasn't. She just needed to hear him say it again so that her brain could catch up with what her heart had already begun to understand. He wasn't joking. And what came next was worse than the words themselves. Because Derek Caldwell, the man she had given up a career for, the man she had followed across the country, the man she had trusted with every vulnerable, unguarded part of herself, looked at his 7 months pregnant wife standing barefoot in the kitchen she had just spent 2 hours cooking in, and he told her the truth. He told her all of it. He told her about Sabrina. Now, you need to understand something. You need to understand who Sabrina was, not just to this story but to Maya specifically. Because this wasn't some stranger. This wasn't a woman Derek had met at a work conference or at some rooftop bar downtown. This was Sabrina Reeves, Maya's best friend since they were 17 years old, the woman who had been her maid of honor at their wedding 3 years ago, the woman who had thrown her baby shower just 6 weeks earlier, who had stood in Maya's own living room surrounded by pink and yellow balloons, laughing and crying happy tears, and holding up tiny onesies and saying, loudly in front of everyone, that she had never seen Maya look more beautiful, more radiant, more deserving of every good thing the world had to offer. That Sabrina, her Sabrina, Derek and Sabrina. Maya's knees almost buckled. She caught the edge of the counter and held on. She asked him how long. He said 4 months. 4 months, which meant it had started before the baby shower, which meant Sabrina had stood in that living room, surrounded by Maya's friends and family, and had smiled and laughed and cried and hugged her, while already being involved with her husband for 4 months. Derek didn't look sorry. That was the part that haunted Maya the most in the weeks that followed, not the betrayal itself, as devastating as it was, but the complete and total absence of remorse on his face. He stood there in that kitchen like a man delivering a business update, like someone wrapping up a meeting that had run slightly over schedule. He told her he wanted her out of the house within 2 weeks. He told her he had already spoken to a lawyer. He told her, and this is the part where the story stops being just painful and starts being something else entirely, something darker. He told her that Sabrina was the kind of woman he should have been with all along, ambitious, sophisticated, connected, And then, as if he hadn't already said enough, as if the knife wasn't already buried deep enough, he added one more thing. He said that he had always known Maya wasn't really on his level, that she had been fine when he was still building things, but that he had outgrown her, that she was sweet, sure, but sweet wasn't going to cut it anymore, not for where he was going. He called her unremarkable in his own kitchen, while she was carrying his child, and then he picked up his briefcase, straightened his jacket, and walked back out the front door. Maya stood alone in that kitchen for a long time. The soup boiled over. She didn't move to stop it. She just stood there, one hand on her stomach, one hand on the counter, while the sound of his car backing out of the driveway faded away into the evening quiet. And then, very slowly, she sat down on the kitchen floor, and she cried in a way she had never cried before in her life. Not the kind of crying that comes with sound, but the silent, airless kind. The kind where your body shakes and your mouth opens but nothing comes out. The kind that only happens when the pain is so total, so complete, that it bypasses your voice entirely and goes straight to your bones. She was 7 months pregnant. She was alone, and the two people she had trusted more than anyone else in the world had just destroyed everything. But here is what Derek Caldwell did not know on that October evening when he walked out of his own kitchen. Here is what he could not have imagined, even in his most arrogant, most self-satisfied moments. He did not know who Maya really was, not the Maya he had dismissed as unremarkable, not the Maya he thought he had figured out and outgrown. He did not know her story, the real story, the one she had kept carefully folded and tucked away, not out of deception, but out of a deep, aching desire to be loved simply, plainly, for exactly who she was, and nothing more. He didn't know. And that, as you are about to discover, would cost him absolutely everything. But to understand how this story ends, you have to understand how it began. You have to go back to before the soup in the kitchen and the quiet devastation of that Tuesday evening. You have to go back to where Derek and Maya started, and you have to understand the kind of man Derek Caldwell truly was, and the kind of woman Maya had always been, and the strange, intricate way that those two very different truths eventually collided. Derek Caldwell had grown up comfortably, not wealthy, comfortable. His father had owned a mid-sized construction company in Atlanta, and Derek had spent his childhood watching his father work 18-hour days to give the family a life that looked solid from the outside. He had grown up in a nice house in a nice neighborhood, gone to decent schools, and developed somewhere along the way an almost obsessive relationship with the concept of status, with what things looked like, with what people thought. By the time he was 32, Derek had turned a small commercial real estate firm into something genuinely impressive. He had worked hard for it, that much was true, and credit where credit is due. He was smart, he was driven, and he had an instinct for opportunity that most people in his industry envied deeply. He had the right suits, the right car, the right apartment in the right neighborhood. He had cultivated a life that announced itself, a life that said to everyone who encountered it, that Derek Caldwell was someone who mattered. What he had not cultivated, what no amount of commercial success had ever managed to give him, was the kind of inner security that doesn't need to announce itself, the kind that doesn't require an audience. He was a man who measured his own worth by the room he was in, and who measured the worth of the people around him the same way. If you added to his image, he valued you. If you didn't, he found you lacking. It was as simple and as ugly as that. He met Maya at a charity auction 6 years ago. She was 27. She was wearing a simple green dress and talking to an elderly woman in a wheelchair near the back of the room, completely ignoring the cocktail crowd and the networking energy that crackled through the rest of the space. She was laughing at something the old woman had said, genuinely laughing, the kind that puts real lines at the corners of your eyes, and Derek had noticed her immediately. Not because of her dress or her hair or the way she moved, though she was undeniably lovely. He noticed her because of the contrast, because in a room full of people who were very aggressively trying to be seen, she was entirely unbothered by it. She wasn't performing. She wasn't positioning herself. She was just there, present and warm and entirely herself. He introduced himself. She shook his hand with a directness he hadn't expected, told him her name, and went back to her conversation with the elderly woman without missing a beat. He had to try 3 separate times that evening to get her full attention. He later told people it was the first time in years a woman had made him work for it. What he meant, though he didn't understand it at the time, was that it was the first time in years a woman had made him feel something genuinely unscripted, something real. They dated for a year and a half before he proposed. And during that time, Maya was exactly what she appeared to be. Warm, thoughtful, quietly funny, completely unpretentious in a way that occasionally confused people who moved in Derek's circles, but that he found, at least in those early years, genuinely refreshing. She didn't talk about money. She didn't name drop. She drove a modest car, lived in a modest apartment, and seemed wholly unimpressed by the expensive restaurants and weekend trips and small demonstrations of wealth that Derek used to signal his interest in a woman. She accepted his invitations but never seemed dazzled by them. She thanked him sincerely but never gushed. She was interested in him, in who he was, in what he thought, in what had shaped him, in a way that felt different from anyone he had dated before. What Derek didn't ask, and what Maya didn't volunteer, was the question of where she came from. He assumed. The modest car and the modest apartment painted a picture that he filled in himself, and he never thought to look more carefully. He saw what he expected to see, and what he expected to see, given those surface details, was a woman of ordinary means. Decent family, probably. Middle-class background. Nothing remarkable. Fine for now, perhaps, but not someone who would age well alongside his ambitions. He told himself he loved her anyway, and for a while, maybe he did. Or at least, he loved the version of her he had constructed, the simple, sweet, uncomplicated woman who made him feel grounded without threatening his sense of superiority. He asked her to marry him at dinner one evening, in a restaurant he had specifically chosen because several of his colleagues frequented it, and he knew the optics would be excellent. Maya had said yes with tears in her eyes, and both hands cupped around his face, and he had kissed her while the restaurant applauded. And in that moment he had been genuinely, uncomplicated, happy. The wedding was elegant and tasteful, and covered in a local lifestyle magazine. Maya's side of the guest list had been smaller than Derek's, which he had noted privately and taken as further confirmation of his assumptions about her background. Her parents had attended, a quiet, understated couple who had traveled from out of state. Her father, a silver-haired man named Arthur, had shaken Derek's hand at a reception with a steady grip and said simply that he hoped Derek understood what he was being entrusted with. Derek had smiled and said of course. He had no idea what the man meant. He would spend years not understanding it. Maya left her job at a non-profit organization when they moved to a larger home in a suburb outside of Chicago. Derek had suggested it. He liked the idea of her being available, of the house being managed, of their life running smoothly, while he focused on growing the business. She had agreed without complaint, though she had privately loved that job, loved the work, loved a sense of purpose it gave her. She had told herself it was temporary. A chapter, not the whole book. She had been telling herself that for 3 years when she found out she was pregnant. The pregnancy had been unplanned but genuinely welcomed. Maya had cried when she saw the test, happy tears immediately. She had called Derek at the office and he had gone quiet for a moment before saying all the right things. He had come home with flowers that evening, and they had sat together on the back porch and talked about the future with a tenderness that Maya would hold on to later. Like a photograph from a trip you never thought you'd miss. But something had shifted in Derek after that. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, and then with a gathering momentum that Maya kept trying to explain away. He started coming home later. He started taking calls during dinners. He started looking at her differently. Not unkindly at first, just differently. Like she was something familiar that he had maybe started to take for granted. Like she had shifted in his estimation from a choice he had made to simply furniture he had accumulated. She asked him once, in a quiet moment, if everything was okay with them. He had said yes, of course, and changed the subject. She had not pushed. She blamed her own anxiety, her hormones, her insecurity. She had spent months convincing herself that the distance she felt was in her own head. It was not in her own head. Sabrina Rees had been Maya's best friend since junior year of high school, when they had been assigned seats next to each other in English class, and had bonded over a shared, slightly scandalous opinion about a book their teacher considered sacred. They had been inseparable for a decade after that, through college. First jobs, first heartbreaks, the way real friendships are forged in all the unguarded, unglamorous moments of becoming an adult. Maya had been the steady one, the one who showed up at 2 in the morning when Sabrina called crying, the one who gave honest advice even when it wasn't what Sabrina wanted to hear, the one who showed up again and again with a reliability that Sabrina had always leaned on but never quite matched. Sabrina was beautiful in a way that commanded attention, sharp cheekbones, a laugh that carried across a room, an ease with people that made her socially magnetic. She was also, though Maya had never allowed herself to fully articulate this, deeply envious of anyone who had something she didn't. It was a quality she disguised well, buried under warmth and humor, and a talent for making you feel like the most important person in any room, but it was there, it had always been there, and it had a particular, focused intensity when it was directed at Maya, because Maya, for all her apparent simplicity, had a life that looked, from a certain angle, like everything Sabrina had ever wanted. A beautiful home, a successful husband, a pregnancy that radiated health and happiness, and something else, something harder to name but impossible to ignore, an ease within herself that Sabrina, for all her charisma, had never quite managed to find. How it started between Sabrina and Derek, exactly, Maya pieced together only gradually, from fragments and context, and the occasional painful admission. It had begun apparently at a dinner party Maya had not been able to attend. She had been in her second trimester, exhausted, and had asked Derek to go alone. Sabrina had also been there. They had talked for a long time about business, about ambition, about the kind of life you could build if you were ruthless enough and smart enough and willing to do what other people weren't. Derek had apparently found in Sabrina a mirror for his own hunger, someone who spoke his particular language of desire and status and forward momentum, someone who seemed to see him the way he wanted to be seen. Sabrina, for her part, had seen an opportunity. That is not a charitable interpretation. It is, however, the accurate one. Over the following months, as Maya grew and glowed and prepared for a life she believed was still intact, Derek and Sabrina had met secretly, had texted constantly, had constructed between them a narrative in which Maya was the obstacle and they were the story. Derek had begun referring to Maya, in his private conversations with Sabrina, as his mistake, as his past, as the thing he needed to shed in order to become the man he was supposed to be. Sabrina had encouraged every word of this. She had validated every cruelty. She had helped him build, piece by piece, the justification he needed to walk into that kitchen on a Tuesday evening and destroy his marriage with the same detached efficiency with which he handled a bad investment. The divorce papers arrived 2 days after that conversation in the kitchen. Maya's hands shook when she opened the envelope. She read through them slowly, sitting at the same kitchen table where she had eaten every dinner for 3 years, and she felt something inside her, something she hadn't expected, begin to harden, not into bitterness, not into hatred, into clarity, into a cold, precise understanding of exactly what was happening and exactly what she needed to do. She called her mother that evening, her mother, a woman named Eleanor, who had the quiet authority of someone who has seen a great deal of the world and survived most of it with her grace intact, listened without interrupting for a very long time. When Maya had finished, Eleanor was silent for a moment, and then she said very calmly that it was time, that the thing they had been waiting for, the thing that Maya had always had the right to use but had chosen, out of love and hope, to leave alone. It was time. Maya understood exactly what her mother meant. You see, here is what Derek Caldwell had built his entire understanding of his marriage on. A story he had told himself about who Maya was, where she came from, and what she was worth. And like all stories told by men who prefer their assumptions to the truth, it was built on foundations he had never bothered to test. Arthur Winters, Maya's father, the silver-haired man with a steady handshake at the wedding, was not a man of modest means. He was, in fact, the founder and primary shareholder of Winters Caldwell Property Group, one of the largest privately held real estate development companies in the eastern United States, a company with assets in the hundreds of millions. A company that had been quietly, methodically building a portfolio for 30 years, while Arthur himself maintained a life of deliberate understatement, because Arthur Winters believed that the most dangerous thing a wealthy man could do was let the world know exactly what he had. Maya was Arthur's only child, his sole heir, and the trust fund that had been established in her name on the day she was born, a trust she had never touched, never drawn from, never so much as mentioned to the man she had chosen to love, contained more money than Derek Caldwell's entire business was worth. Maya had kept this hidden, not as a strategy, not as a trap, but because she had always believed that she wanted to be loved without it. She had watched her father's money attract the wrong kind of people her whole life, had watched it complicate and corrupt and distort every relationship it touched, and she had made a choice, a deliberate, carefully considered choice, to step away from it and build a life on what she herself could offer, on her warmth, her loyalty, her capacity for love, on the plain, unadorned truth of who she was. She had loved Derek without the money. She had married him without it. She had given him 3 years of a devotion that was entirely free of transaction, and in return he had looked at the woman she chose to present to the world, the woman without the glittering context of inherited wealth, and he had called her unremarkable. He had made his choice with the wrong information, and now it was time for him to learn how expensive that mistake had been. Maya called a lawyer the next morning. Not just any lawyer, she called the woman who had been managing the Winters family's legal affairs for 15 years, a razor-sharp attorney named Caroline Park who had the kind of reputation in Chicago legal circles that made opposing counsel go slightly pale when they heard her name. Maya explained the situation. Caroline listened, asked 2 or 3 very precise questions, and then said, with a calm that somehow contained an undercurrent of enormous satisfaction, that this was going to be very interesting. Derek had hired his own lawyer, of course, a man named Preston Walsh, who was competent and well-regarded, and who had handled Derek's business contracts for years. Preston had gone into the initial divorce proceedings expecting a straightforward dissolution. Derek had been characteristically blunt about his expectations. He wanted the house, he wanted the business assets protected, and he was willing to offer Maya a modest spousal support arrangement that, in his private estimation, was already more generous than she deserved. He had shared these expectations with Preston, who had drafted an initial proposal accordingly, and who had then submitted it to the office of Caroline Park-esque. The response that came back 3 days later did not, apparently, go the way Preston expected. Maya never found out exactly what Caroline said to Preston in that first phone call, but she did find out, second-hand through a mutual acquaintance, that Preston had called Derek immediately afterward and had said, with unusual urgency, that they needed to meet in person that same afternoon. Derek arrived at that meeting with the confidence of a man who was certain he had the upper hand. He left it unable to speak on the drive home, because Caroline Park had submitted, along with Maya's response to the divorce filing, a document, a financial disclosure document, complete, accurate, and absolutely impossible to challenge, a document that outlined in precise legal language the full scope of Maya Winters Caldwell's personal assets, including the trust established in her name, the inheritance right she held as sole heir to her father's estate, and a current valuation prepared by one of the most respected financial appraisal firms in the state. The number on that document was so far beyond what Derek had ever imagined that Preston, by all accounts, had to read it twice before he said anything. Derek had gone into that divorce expecting to walk away from a woman he considered unremarkable, modestly provided for, dependent on his generosity. What the document told him, what he was forced to understand, sitting in that leather chair across from his own attorney, was that he was not divorcing a woman of modest means. He was divorcing the sole heir to a real estate empire. He was divorcing a woman who, on paper, was worth roughly 7 times what he was. He was divorcing the woman his own father-in-law had once told him, very quietly and very seriously, was being entrusted to his care. He had not understood that sentence when Arthur Winters said it at the wedding. He understood it now in a way that sat in his stomach like cold stone. But even this, even the staggering financial revelation, was not the part of the story that destroyed Derek Caldwell completely. That part was still coming, and it was coming from a direction he had never once thought to look. In the weeks following the initial legal exchange, Derek and Sabrina had become openly involved. They'd been photographed together at a restaurant that Maya and Derek had frequented as a couple, a detail that several of Maya's friends had texted her about with increasing outrage. Sabrina had moved some of her things into Derek's apartment downtown, the one he had retreated to while the divorce proceedings played out, and the two of them had cultivated a very visible, public couplehood that had all the performative energy of people trying to prove something. What they were trying to prove, Maya suspected, was that they were happy, that it had been the right decision, that the burning down of everything that came before was justified by the warmth of what they were building in its place. She recognized the performance because she had watched Sabrina perform for her entire adult life. What she had never seen before was Derek performing. It unsettled her in a different way, not because she missed him. She was surprised to discover, in those raw, honest weeks after the kitchen conversation, that what she had felt for Derek had already begun to change shape, to reveal itself as something more habitual than essential. What unsettled her was the realization of how thoroughly she had been deceived by someone who had apparently been performing all along. Her daughter was born in December on a cold, bright Wednesday morning, in a private room at Northwestern Memorial Hospital that Eleanor Winters had arranged with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything Maya's mother did. Maya's parents were both there, Arthur holding Maya's hand with a tenderness that made her cry before the pain even began. Eleanor standing near the window and projecting a calm so total and so genuine that the nurses kept mistaking her for someone medical. There was no one else. No husband. No best friend. No one from the life Maya had built and lost in the space of a few months. But there was the baby, 7 pounds 3 ounces, with dark eyes and perfect fingers, and a cry that was somehow both furious and entirely assured, like she had arrived with an agenda and didn't have time for ceremony. Maya held her for the first time and felt something that no word in any language has ever quite managed to capture, that absolute, cellular recognition of the most important love of your life, arriving all at once, without warning, without any of the prerequisites you thought you needed. She named her Iris, after the flower, after the eye, after the part of the eye that controls how much light you let in. Derek was informed of the birth through their respective attorneys. He sent a brief message, formal, clinical, arranged in sentences that bore the fingerprints of legal counsel rather than human feeling, acknowledging the birth and stating his intent to establish paternity through appropriate channels. The phrase, establish paternity through appropriate channels, had been Caroline Park's particular focus in her response, which Maya was told had been brief, precise, and somewhat withering. But here is where you need to pay close attention, because the paternity matter, the request that Derek had filed, more as a procedural formality than out of any genuine doubt, through his attorney, was about to become something neither of them had anticipated. It was about to become the thread that, when pulled, unraveled the entire story. Derek had filed for a paternity test as part of a divorce proceedings, framed primarily as a legal protection measure for custody purposes. He had not, apparently, filed it out of any genuine suspicion that Iris was not his daughter. He and Maya had been the only relationship either of them had been in at the time of conception. Of that much he was, at some level, still certain. The test was, in his mind, a formality, a box to check. What made it interesting, what made it the kind of story that would eventually travel far beyond the walls of a Chicago courtroom, was a separate but entirely connected event that happened 3 weeks after Iris was born. An event that arrived not in a legal document but in a text message. A text message that found its way to Derek from a number he didn't immediately recognize. A number that turned out to belong to a man named Marcus Cole. Marcus Cole was Sabrina's ex-boyfriend. Specifically, he had been Sabrina's boyfriend for the 14 months immediately preceding the period during which she had begun her involvement with Derek. He and Sabrina had ended things, supposedly, around the same time that Sabrina had started appearing more frequently in Maya's home, more frequently at Derek and Maya's social engagements, more frequently in the orbit of Derek's life. Supposedly ended things. Marcus Cole had a different timeline. Marcus Cole, who had been quiet for months, processing his own wounds in his own private way, had reached a point at which his silence felt to him less like dignity and more like complicity, and so he had found Derek's number. Not a difficult task, given that Derek's professional contact information was publicly available. And he had sent a text message that contained, in plain, unambiguous language, an account of the last time he and Sabrina had been together. That last time, according to Marcus, had not been before Sabrina's involvement with Derek. It had been during it. Specifically, it had been approximately 9 weeks before Sabrina had announced with great emotional fanfare that she was pregnant. 9 weeks. Derek read that text message 3 times in his car, parked outside the building where he and Sabrina were now sharing an apartment. He read it once quickly and didn't fully absorb it. He read it a second time slowly and felt his body go cold. He read it a third time with the kind of deliberate, terrifying attention you give to something you are hoping will change meaning on further examination. It didn't change meaning. He went inside. He found Sabrina in the kitchen. She was on the phone, laughing at something, leaning against the counter the way she always did when a conversation was going well. She saw his face, and her laughter stopped. She ended the call. She asked him what was wrong. He held up his phone. He read her the text message aloud. He watched every shade of color leave her face as the words landed one by one. What followed was a conversation that lasted 4 hours and covered ground so devastating, so irreversible, so fundamentally ugly that even Derek, who was not by most measures a man of particularly fine emotional sensibility, came out the other end of it, fundamentally altered, Sabrina cried. She deflected. She argued about timelines, about the reliability of Marcus's account, about motives and grudges and the basic unreliability of hurt people. She said things that were designed to land softly, and instead landed with all the weight of their own implausibility. Derek was many things. He was arrogant. He was vain. He was cold to people who could not serve his purposes. But he was not stupid, and he could hear, in the architecture of Sabrina's explanations, the sound of a woman trying to build a room that would not hold. The hesitations in the wrong places, the details that didn't quite line up, the specific, particular firmness with which she refused to address the one question that actually mattered, when Derek asked her directly, point blank, looking her in the eye, if there was any possibility that the baby was Marcus's. Sabrina did not say no. What she said was that she didn't think so, that she was almost certain, that he was being unreasonable, that he was letting one vindictive text from her bitter ex-boyfriend undo everything they had built together. Almost certain. Derek had hired an attorney to handle a divorce. He had not hired one to handle the possibility that his entire new life had been constructed on a lie more fundamental and more humiliating than anything he had ever imagined. He sat in silence for a long time after Sabrina finished talking. She reached across the table and put her hand on his. He looked at her hand. He thought about all the moments of the past 6 months, the texts, the meetings, the way she had spoken about Maya, the ease with which she had helped him dismantle a marriage, the absolute certainty with which she had presented herself as the better choice, the right choice, the choice that anyone with real ambition and real taste would obviously make. He thought about the soup. He thought about Maya in that kitchen. He thought about what he had said to her, unremarkable, and something in him shifted, slowly and painfully, in a direction he had not expected to travel. He asked Sabrina to take a DNA test. She said she needed to think about it. That answer was its own kind of answer. In the months that followed, the legal machinery of Derek's life began its complicated, grinding work on multiple fronts. Simultaneously, the divorce from Maya was proceeding, slowly, given the complexity that the financial disclosures had introduced, and the meticulousness with which Caroline Park approached every document Derek's legal team produced. The paternity question regarding Iris had been tested through standard channels, the samples collected and submitted and processed with the impersonal efficiency of laboratory science. The results awaited by 2 legal teams and 1 man, who, sitting in the waiting room of his own unraveling, was beginning to understand that he had made errors, not just tactical errors, not just financial ones, but errors of character, of perception, of the most fundamental kind. The Iris results came first. They arrived in a formal document prepared by a certified laboratory, transmitted to both legal teams simultaneously. Caroline Park called Maya herself to read the relevant section aloud. Maya was sitting in the sunlit bedroom of her parents' home, the home she had grown up in, the home she had returned to after leaving the house in the suburbs. With Iris asleep on her chest, she listened to Caroline's voice. She heard the confirmation. 100%, no question, no ambiguity. Iris Caldwell was Derek's biological daughter, which meant that Derek had looked at his pregnant wife, had looked at the woman who was carrying his actual, legitimate, irreplaceable child, and had called her unremarkable, had chosen someone else, had chosen wrong in every direction at every possible level. The results for Sabrina's paternity test, obtained finally, after a legal process that had required rather more pressure than should have been necessary, came 6 days later. Those results were equally unambiguous in their own way. They confirmed what Marcus Cole's text message had suggested, and what Sabrina's own hesitation had effectively admitted. The child Sabrina was carrying did not belong to Derek Caldwell. Derek received both sets of results on the same afternoon. His attorney, Preston Walsh, delivered them in person, a choice that spoke to the gravity of the moment in a way that even Preston's usually composed professional demeanor couldn't fully conceal. Preston sat across from Derek and placed both documents on the table side by side. He said nothing. He let Derek read. Derek read for a long time. The room was very quiet. Somewhere outside the window, Chicago continued its ordinary Thursday. Traffic and wind and the distant sound of a train. Derek sat in the silence with 2 pieces of paper and the full weight of everything they represented. His daughter was real. His daughter was his. He had walked out on his real daughter and her mother. A woman of extraordinary grace and extraordinary means who had loved him without requiring him to be anything other than what he was. And he had done it to be with a woman who had been lying to him from the very beginning, a woman who had, in all likelihood, targeted him, who had watched his marriage and seen not a love story to be respected but an opportunity to be exploited, who had used him as an escape route from a situation she needed to leave, and who had packaged that exploitation in the language of passion and destiny. And he deserves better, and he had believed every word. He had been played, thoroughly, completely, expensively, and the worst of it, the part that sat in him like something permanent and unremovable, was that it had not been done to him by some stranger. It had been done to him by someone he had helped, someone he had conspired with, someone who could not have succeeded without his own willing, enthusiastic participation in the dismantling of something real. He had done this, not to himself alone. He had done it to Maya. He had done it to Iris. He had walked into a kitchen where his wife was cooking soup for him, and he had said the cruelest things he knew how to say to a person, and he had walked out, and he had been so confident in his own judgment, so certain of the story he was telling himself, that it hadn't even occurred to him to question whether any of it was true. The call came on a Wednesday morning, from Maya, not from Caroline Park, not through legal channels, from Maya herself on her personal number, in a voice that was completely steady and entirely without performance. She said she thought they should talk, not about the case, not through lawyers, just talk. She said she wasn't calling to yell at him or to make him feel worse than he already presumably did. She said she was calling because they had a daughter together, and because whatever had happened between the two of them, Iris was going to grow up in a world where her parents' relationship was part of the context she inherited, and Maya wanted that context to be something she could live with, something Iris could understand someday without shame. Derek had almost not answered. He had looked at her name on his screen for a long time before picking up. He didn't know what he expected her to say. Something angry, probably. Something earned. Something he deserved. What he got was Maya. Just Maya. Clear and measured and entirely focused on what actually mattered. They met for coffee at a quiet place on the north side. Neutral ground that Maya had chosen. She arrived with Iris in a carrier against her chest. The baby asleep and faintly audible. That small, soft sound of infant breathing that has the power to rearrange everything. Derek sat across from her and looked at his daughter for the first time in the flesh. This small, perfect, absolutely certain fact that existed because of the two of them, that predated all the betrayal and the cruelty and the legal documents and the paternity tests, that would continue to exist long after all of it had faded. He cried. He hadn't expected to cry. He was not, historically, a man who cried in public or in private, and the arrival of tears surprised him almost as much as it surprised Maya. He watched in with an expression that was not satisfaction. She was not that person, had never been that person, but a kind of witnessing, a quiet, compassionate, entirely clear-eyed recognition of a man sitting in the consequences of his own choices. He apologized. He said it plainly, without qualification, which was also unlike him. He was usually a man who dressed his apologies in explanations until they stopped being apologies, but what he said at that table was simple. He said he had been wrong. He said he had been cruel. He said the things he had called her were untrue and unforgivable, and that he knew an apology didn't constitute repair. He said he understood if she never trusted him again. He said he wanted to be a father to Iris if she would allow it, and that he would accept whatever terms Maya set because she had more than earned the right to set them. Maya listened to all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She looked down at Iris, then back up at him. She said that she believed him. She said she was not going to use their daughter as an instrument of punishment because their daughter was not a tool. She was a person, with her own future and her own needs, and those needs were what mattered now. She said she would allow him a relationship with Iris. She said it would be gradual and supervised at first, and earned the way all important things are earned, through consistent, unglamorous, quietly demonstrated effort over time. She did not say she forgave him. Some things take longer than a conversation over coffee to forgive, and Maya had never been the kind of woman who offered things she didn't mean. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. The settlement reflected the full truth of the financial landscape that Derek had walked into so blindly. Maya's attorney had been thorough and was entirely without mercy, in the way that excellent attorneys are when their client has been genuinely wronged and genuinely has the resources to demand justice. Derek retained his business, which had been legally protected before the marriage in ways that limited Maya's claim to it. But the house Maya had furnished and maintained and made into a home, while Derek made it an address, went to Maya. The investment accounts he had structured in both their names, of which there were several, were divided with a precision that left Derek somewhat winded, and the request he had put forward in the initial filing, the request for spousal support to be kept minimal, given what he had characterized as Maya's modest independent means, was addressed by Caroline Park in language that, by all accounts produced from Derek's attorney, the sound of a man briefly losing his composure. Sabrina, for her part, had moved back to her own apartment shortly after the paternity results. She and Derek had ended their involvement, if involvement was even the right word for something that had been built on exploitation, and had ended in its exposure. Without ceremony or resolution, in the cold, practical way that things end when the lie that held them together is removed. She was not, the last anyone heard, in a particularly good place. Marcus had declined to be involved with the child, citing the deception. Her social circle, which had been built substantially on the borrowed warmth of her proximity to Maya, had contracted sharply. People who had been cheerfully neutral during the affair had found, in the light of the full story, that their neutrality was harder to maintain. Even some of the people who had sat at Maya's baby shower and watched Sabrina perform her loving best friend role with such apparent sincerity had found themselves unable to look at her the same way. After, there is a particular kind of social consequence that arrives not through dramatic confrontation, but through the slow withdrawal of ordinary goodwill. People stop calling, invitations stop coming, conversations at parties become briefly, politely shorter. It is quieter than public humiliation. It is, in many ways, more permanent. Maya did not engineer any of it. She had spoken to exactly 3 people about what Sabrina had done: her mother, her attorney, and one close friend who had asked her directly and deserved the truth. She had not posted about it. She had not organized a campaign. She had simply lived her life, with Iris and her parents, in the house that was now entirely hers, and let the truth travel the way truth tends to travel, on its own, at its own pace, to exactly the people who needed to understand it. By the time spring came, Iris was 5 months old, newly interested in her own hands, increasingly insistent on having opinions about things. Maya had begun to rebuild, not to reconstruct the life she had before, which had been built on certain assumptions that no longer applied, but to build something new. Something that had her actual name on it, her actual choices. She rejoined the board of her family's company, a role she had deferred for 3 years while trying to make a marriage work. Her father had kept the seat warm for her with the patience and faith that had always characterized his relationship with his daughter, and when she walked into that boardroom for the first time, Iris in a carrier against her chest, because the nanny had called in sick, and Maya had refused to reschedule. The people around that table, people who had known her since childhood, who had watched her step away and come back and step away again, had stood up, not because of the money she represented or the shares she held, but because of what it meant to see her there, present, decided, unbroken. She began advising a non-profit that worked with women in housing insecurity, work that connected directly to both her professional expertise and the particular insight that comes from having been, however briefly and however differently, a woman who didn't know where her stability was coming from. She approached the work with the kind of focused, grounded energy that happens when a person's professional life and their deepest personal convictions finally point in the same direction. Derek, true to his word, showed up. It was gradual and supervised, and, as Maya had promised, earned. He came every other Sunday, first for 2 hours, then 3, then eventually for full days. He didn't try to renegotiate terms or push boundaries, or use Iris as a vehicle for proximity to Maya, which had been, if she was honest, a concern she had held privately in the early months. He just showed up, consistently, quietly, in a way that didn't demand credit or recognition. He learned how to hold Iris correctly, and then how to make her laugh, and then, eventually, how to be simply present with her in the unhurried, unperformative way that small children require, and that had never previously been his strength. Maya watched this happen from a careful distance. She felt, in observing it, a complicated mix of things that she did not try to simplify. A residual sadness for the version of this she had once hoped for and never received. A genuine gladness that Iris would have a father who was growing into the role in real time rather than abandoning it. And a kind of understanding that surprised her by arriving without bitterness. Derek had been a certain kind of man, and then the world had required something different of him, and he had, slowly, imperfectly, without fanfare, begun the work of becoming it. It didn't undo what he had done, but it was real. She could see it was real. And Maya had always had a particular respect for real things, even when they were complicated. She did not take him back. She was asked about this later, not by Derek, who never asked, who seemed to understand with a new and hard-won clarity that some doors, once closed in the particular way that this one had been closed, are not doors you get to open again, but by people on the periphery of her life who had not witnessed all of it, and therefore felt free to have opinions about the narrative arc. People who thought the story required a reconciliation to be complete. Maya told them, with characteristic gentleness and complete firmness, that the story was complete, that Iris was complete, that she herself was complete, that the satisfaction she felt in her life had nothing to do with Derek, and everything to do with what she had chosen to build in the space his departure had, painfully and generously, made available. She told her mother this over dinner one evening with Iris in the high chair between them, determinedly and messily, exploring the concept of mashed sweet potato, and Eleanor had looked at her daughter for a long moment and said simply that Arthur had always known from the very beginning that Maya was going to be fine, that the question had never been whether she was strong enough. The question had only ever been when she would decide to stop carrying other people's stories about her and start living her own. Maya had thought about that for a long time, thought about all the years of making herself smaller, quieter, simpler, not just in her marriage, but in the years before it, in the careful, self-protective way she had moved through a world that she had the resources to occupy very differently, but that she had not trusted enough, or trusted enough Ameshni as way in to fully claim. She thought about the green dress and the charity auction and the elderly woman in the wheelchair and the moment Derek had introduced himself, and she had gone back to her conversation without giving him her full attention, not as a strategy, just because she hadn't been ready to be pulled into something bigger than herself yet. She was ready now, more than ready. Iris was 8 months old when Maya launched the first phase of a new housing initiative under the Winters Family Foundation, a project that would eventually convert 3 underutilized properties in Chicago's South Side into permanent supportive housing for women and children in crisis situations. The project had taken 4 months to design and would take 2 years to complete, and Maya had personally visited every site, reviewed every proposal, and sat in every community meeting with a kind of focused, unglamorous commitment that good work requires, and that good work eventually always reflects. There was a photograph taken at the groundbreaking ceremony for the first site by a journalist from a local magazine who had been covering the story for months. In the photograph, Maya is standing in a hard hat on a muddy construction site, Iris on her hip, looking directly into the camera with an expression that is not a smile. Exactly, but something better than a smile. Something settled. Something that has arrived at itself through difficulty and found that it likes what it found there. The magazine ran it on its cover. The headline was Maya's own words, pulled from an interview she'd given the week before. It read, simply, "I was always here." People who had known her during the years of her marriage, the suburban house, the modest car, the careful smallness of a life built around someone else's requirements, read those words and understood them immediately, understood what they meant, understood the fullness of what had been hidden, not taken, not lost, simply waiting, patiently and completely, for the moment it could finally be known. Derek saw the magazine. He kept a copy of it. He didn't tell anyone that. It wasn't the kind of thing he would have said out loud. And in any case, there was no one in his life at that point to whom he would have wanted to admit it, but he kept it. On the shelf in his office, behind some other things, where it wouldn't be immediately visible, but where he could find it when he needed to. It was not a monument to what he had lost, though it was also that. It was something more specific. It was a reminder, the kind that costs you everything to earn, of what happens when you look at another person and think you already understand who they are, when you decide, without asking, without looking carefully, without sitting with the full weight of another human life and giving it the attention it deserves, that you know what something is worth. He had looked at Maya and seen ordinary. He had not looked closely enough to see extraordinary, and the distance between those two words, the distance between what he had assumed and what was actually true, had been, in the end, the exact measurement of his own undoing. There are moments in life that split everything into 2 halves, the before and the after, and when you are in the before, even if something in you knows that a particular thing cannot hold. You tell yourself the story you need in order to stay comfortable, in order to stay in control, in order to avoid the terrifying work of looking honestly at what you have and understanding what it actually is. Derek had told himself a story. It was a story about a man who outgrew someone, a man who made a brave and sophisticated choice, a man who was going somewhere big and needed someone who matched that bigness. The story was wrong in every particular that mattered. Maya had never told herself a story. Not about Derek, not about Sabrina, not about herself. She had simply lived, with full attention and full feeling, and the unguarded openness of someone who believes, even when the evidence is against it, that the world will eventually be honest with her. She had been wrong about some things. She had trusted the wrong people and held on to a version of her life that had already quietly ended before she knew it. She had cried on a kitchen floor at 7 months pregnant and felt the particular, destroying loneliness of being betrayed by the two people she had loved without reservation. But she had gotten up. She had made the calls she needed to make and signed the papers she needed to sign and held her daughter in a hospital room and named her Iris and walked into a boardroom and stood at a groundbreaking ceremony and sat across from her ex-husband in a coffee shop and told him the truth about what was going to happen going forward. Not with anger, not with punishment, but with the clean, irreversible authority of a woman who has finally stopped protecting other people from the full scale of who she actually is. That is the story. Not a story about betrayal, though betrayal is in it. Not a story about money, though money is in it. Not a story about revenge, because revenge requires you to keep looking backward, and Maya had too much ahead of her to waste on that. It is a story about the cost of seeing people as you need them to be, instead of as they are. About the price of arrogance. About the slow, non-negotiable return of consequence. About what happens when a man builds his choices on assumptions he never examined, and those assumptions one by one and all at once collapse beneath him. And it is a story about a woman who already knew exactly who she was, who had always known, who simply needed the world, and one particular man's spectacular, costly failure of perception, to finally make it impossible to keep the secret any longer. Iris Caldwell, Iris Winters Caldwell, as her mother would eventually update the birth certificate, grew up knowing her story. Her mother told it to her honestly, in age-appropriate pieces, with the consistency and the care that characterized everything Maya did. She grew up knowing about her grandmother's steady hands and her grandfather's patient faith in the woman her mother had trusted and lost and understood more clearly for the losing. She grew up knowing about the kitchen and the soup and the word unremarkable, because Maya believed that children deserve the truth told to them with love, and because she believed that the thing that had almost broken her was also the thing that had eventually freed her, and that Iris would need to understand that at some point in her own life, that the things that almost break you are also, sometimes if you can survive them, the things that show you exactly how unbreakable you actually are. She grew up knowing all of this, and she grew up, by every account of every person who encountered her, into someone who looked at other people with full attention, who didn't fill in the blanks with assumptions, who sat with complexity and didn't rush it into something simpler just to make herself more comfortable, who understood, from her very first conscious understanding of her own history, that the most dangerous thing you can do with another person is decide you already know what they are worth. She grew up, in other words, like her mother, and that, more than the house, and more than the money, and more than the paternity tests and the legal settlements and the magazine cover, in every piece of very deserved, very complete justice that the universe arranged on Maya's behalf. That is the real ending. That a little girl named Iris grew up in the full light of her mother's life, in a home that told the truth, loved by people who saw her clearly and completely, and grew into someone who passed that clarity forward. Everything else was just a storm that cleared the air so that kind of light could finally get through.